All right, good evening, everyone. So thank you for joining us today for this awesome webinar with Alexandre Eden, or Alex, as he prefers. Alex is an experienced educational consultant specializing in mathematics at the elementary school level, but he also works with the certification of studies, both at the New Frontiers School Board. Before we begin, I'll just take care of a few housekeeping items. So first, the webinar will be recorded for others to view. But also, if you have to step out for anything, don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. This will be available in the next few days. And if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat. We'll make sure that at the end we have plenty of time to ask Alex all the questions that arise. All right, so Alex, the floor is yours.
Perfect. So first and foremost, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see exactly what I see. Hypothetically, you should see it right now. My PowerPoint presentation. Perfect. For thinking routines, as I mentioned, okay, I'm going to be talking about the notice and wonder activities to engage students in meaningful mathematical discourse. Now, when we're talking about thinking routines, and notably the notice and wonder activities, these are activities that were created by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, or if you prefer, the NCTM. You might be wondering, what is a notice and wonder activity? Well, notice and wonder activity basically involves using visual prompts to get the students talking about mathematics. Using the visual prompt, we're going to ask the students, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And what mathematical questions might you be able to pose about the image that you see? So for example, if we look at the New Frontiers logo that we see right over here on the screen, what do we notice? What do we wonder? What type of mathematical questions could we potentially pose about this lovely image? In the chat, you might be able to share some of your answers, and I'll give you a couple seconds just to share what you notice, what you wonder, and what you think about the logo of the New Frontier School Board. Just a couple of seconds so you can possibly get engaged in this. And I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'm going to look at the chat, see what you're writing, and then I'll come back to the image over here. So, is it a road, a beacon? What other noticings do we have? Our chemin. Okay, road. Any other things that we notice about the logo from the New Frontier School Board? Where does it go? Interesting. So once again, I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can see the logo itself. Where's a star? Okay, vers une étoile. Yes. Those are all great observations you've made. Now, if we think in terms of mathematics, what could we possibly notice about this logo? What might we wonder about the logo? We're thinking in terms of mathematics, and here I'm thinking a little bit more advanced maybe. Well, there. What functions might describe the curves? We've got, I don't know, a star over there. What angles are represented in the star, for example? These are all questions that naturally might come to our students if we're lucky. Now, you might be wondering, where do these notice and wonder activities come from? And again, it comes from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, but there are critical thinkers out there who support what we're saying. So for example, Mr. Garfield Ginny Newman, he believes that thinking routines are essential in our classroom for 3 different reasons. And the reasons he outlines are the following. He says, first and foremost, in a thinking classroom, well, the students can engage in discussion and use the appropriate vocabulary. So this will lead to them posing purposeful questions and to us posing purposeful questions, which is probably one of the most important things that we can do as teachers. Next, Garfield Ginny Newman again once says, it provides the students with adequate time to reflect on their learning alone and with others, to think about their answers before being asked to respond. All too often, our students will say, I don't know, when we ask them a question. That's the answer that we want to avoid. We want them to think, we want them to get engaged with mathematics. I also want to provide time for our students to explore our ideas, to try solutions, to make revisions, and even start anew when the initial idea doesn't work out. Because from time to time, it'll happen where they'll be working on a problem and they'll just wonder, like, I don't know where to go from there. And then we can give them maybe a little prompt, a little hint to guide them in the right direction to facilitate their learning. Just even when I asked you, what do you notice about the logo of the New Frontier School Board? I gave you a little bit of time to think about it before you started responding. Now, again, you might be wondering, why do we need these notice and wonder activities? Well, again, the idea is that we want to encourage a mathematical discourse. We want to create little teams in our classroom that are going to work together and learn mathematics together. We want to encourage wondering also because that encourages curiosity, critical thinking. It prompts the students to ask questions that they can't necessarily answer in the moment, but that they'll get the mathematical tools to answer thereafter. In addition to this, other researchers have found that questioning students' observations allows spaces for wondering and creates powerful learning opportunities to make connections and develop positive mathematical identities. Now, perhaps you've read Productive Struggle by Kevin Dykema and John Sangiovanni. If you've read that, you've learned about the importance of having a mathematical identity within the classroom and having a mathematical community that will work together in the classroom. Garfield G. Newman, he presents 6 forms of critical thinking tasks, whether it be decoding the puzzle, judging the better or best, performing to specs, critique the piece, rework the piece, or even design to specs. When we think about the notice and wonder activities, under which type of form do you think it falls? Is it a decoding the puzzle? Are we asking the students to suggest and justify proposed solutions, explanations, interpretations to a confusing or enigmatic situation? Are the students judging the better or the best? Are the students performing to specs? Are the students critiquing the piece, etc.? Where do you think we fall? And again, I invite you in the chat to propose your answers to this little question that I'm posing. And once again, I'm going to stop sharing the screen just so that I can see what you're all writing in the chat. And then we'll look at that there. So again, are we decoding the puzzle? Are we judging? Are we critiquing? What are we doing in this case? Are we designing specs? Are we reworking the piece? Are we critiquing the piece when we're doing a notice and wonder activity? What do you think? Tell me your responses in the chat. 6 possibilities. We're either judging the better or the best, performing to specs, critiquing the piece, working the piece, or design. So I'm starting to see some answers. So I see critiquing. Okay, interesting. Any other hypotheses? Any other ideas? Designing. Okay, interesting. In fact, what I was thinking when I was looking at those 6 different forms was the idea of the puzzle. Because again, we're asking the students, what do you notice? So they're looking at the situation, they're confused initially, and they have to talk about it. They have to explain what they see. Now, in terms of mathematical practices, the NCTM published in 2014 the Principles of Action Ensuring Mathematical Success for All. And there are 8 mathematical practices that are suggested that we should adhere to in order to have a good practice. So, for example, establishing mathematical goals, implement tasks that promote reasoning and problem solving, use and connect mathematical representations, facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse, posing purposeful questions, building procedural fluency from conceptual understanding, supporting productive struggle in learning mathematics, and eliciting the use of evidence student thinking. Well, in the case of the notice and wonder activities, there are 3 of these mathematical practices that we'll be looking at particularly, notably the idea of facilitating mathematical discourse, posing purposeful questions, and eliciting and using evidence of student thinking. Now you'll notice we're building towards a thinking classroom, and there's several steps to get there. Now, there's actually 14 practices proposed by Mr. Peter L. I'm not going to say his family name because I'm going to screw it up. That being said, those 14 practices, we don't do them all in one shot. We do it piece by piece by piece. And in fact, when we're preparing for the notice and wonder activities, you'll notice that there's a couple of these that we're going to be using, a couple of these practices. So for example, we'll be using potentially random groups, because I talked about having mathematical discourse, groups talking. We talked about giving thinking tasks. We will talk about defronting the classroom. You know, all these come into practice with the notice and wonder activities, but again, it's a step-by-step process. We're not expecting you to do it all at once. A mathematical discourse, obviously, we have to anticipate that we're going to have teams working together. If we're working with the lower grades, that is to say grades K to 2, then teams of 2 are going to be better. And the reason for that is because they're going to be able to have an exchange, which eventually, with the guidance of the teacher, will go to the word collaboration. If we do teams that are bigger than 2, the yipping and yapping will start and it gets to conflict, and then we get into classroom management, which is what we want to avoid. Grades 3 and up, they're a little more mature. Now we could have teams of 3. The beauty of this is that we avoid redundancy. So we're going to get a whole big plethora of ideas, thoughts, and thinking going on in the team. In addition to this, we get diversity. So we have students of different backgrounds working together, collaborating, learning from each other. There are many benefits of having random groups. 1, we increase the thinking in our group. 2, we increase the willingness to collaborate. So we're not just working with our friends at all times. We're eliminating social barriers. So we're all working together to learn from each other. We're increasing knowledge and mobility. We're increasing enthusiasm for learning mathematics, and we're reducing social stresses, those anxieties caused by those social barriers. But I get it. Random groups is not for every single teacher, okay? It's hard. You have to have a lot of confidence in your ability as a teacher. So oftentimes we do fall into the idea of assigning roles to students. And the advantage of assigning roles to students is that it slows them down and forces them to think about their role and engages them a little bit more. It orients them a little bit more, if you want, in the discussion. So for example, you might think, well, okay, I could have an animator or mediator within the group. I could have somebody who's keeping track of the time in the group. I could have somebody who's taking notes for the group. Now, these roles are all subjective. It's up to you to decide the roles that you would assign to your students. But these are actually 3 different roles that one teacher actually used with the students when I went to model a notice and wonder and activity in their classroom. We want to encourage collaborative thinking amongst our students. We want them to work together. We want them to encourage each other's ideas, and we want them to understand that making mistakes is okay. In that sense, we need a community that will work together. We need students that understand that math is accessible to all, but not necessarily at the same rate. Now, I've already mentioned the book Productive Math Struggle by Kevin Dykema and San Giovanni. You can actually see the cover down over there. But it's a really interesting book because it tells us what a productive struggle community should look like. So it involves working with our partners, sharing the work, taking turns, listening to others. It involves sharing ideas, valuing others' input. So knowing that everybody has a good idea and has something to offer. It involves making mistakes. We need to understand that the mistakes that we make will help us learn. It's not a detriment to us. It's not something to be shy about. We need to get our students active in taking risks, asking others their questions, their ideas. We need to respect the ideas of others. And we need to know what to do when we're stuck. Basically, we need to know when to ask for help. These are all skills that students learn in a thinking classroom. Continuing on, the idea of teamwork, well, some of us might want to go for that conventional classroom where all the desks are pointing towards the teacher's desk is at the front, but that's not going to lead towards that collaborative thinking, that collaboration that we want amongst the students. To get them to be able to talk amongst one another, we want to defront the classroom. So if you look, for example, on my diagram over here on the upper right corner, you'll notice that the tables are put in teams and the students are facing each other so they can actually talk to one another and get input from one another. They're not all necessarily facing the front of the class. This placement will set the expectations for your classroom. And it's really important that you set the tone right from the beginning. Your students might not be used to working in teams like this, but from time to time, it is important to do. Now that we've thought of all the logistics behind creating this thinking classroom and starting to establish these notice and wonder activities, the question becomes, where can we find them? Now, these notice and wonder activities are actually available on the NCTM, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics website. Unfortunately, and this is the only little ick behind it, you have to be a member to be able to have access to these notice and wonder activities. If you're not an active member, unfortunately, you don't have access to the activities, but that doesn't mean that you can't find activities similar online or that you can't find an image that you could use to prompt your students towards mathematical thinking. When you look at the lessons that you could download, there are lessons for all different levels and covering all different topics. Be warned, these are American activities, so the levels might not correspond to what we have in the progressive learning. So you need to be cautiously aware when you're looking at the activities. The one activity I did with a teacher was the activity that you see with the balloons over here. And when we asked the students, what do you notice? What do you wonder? Some of the noticings or some of the wonderings that we got first and foremost was, well, we notice that there's a lot of balloons. We notice that there's balloons of different colors. We notice that there are different rows of balloons. And then we got some wonderings too. Well, how many balloons are there? Is there a significance to the color behind the balloons? And one of the most impressive mathematical questions that we got out of this was a student who actually asked the teacher, well, miss, I'd like to know how much it would cost to have that many balloons, to be able to do such an activity, which was a question completely unexpected, but very interesting to see because the student was thinking outside the box a little bit. Every single notice and wonder activity comes with 3 different slides, basically a PowerPoint if you want. So the first slide is always your visual prompt. Second slide is one which says, what do you notice and what do you wonder? And the teacher can use this to put the students' top answers on the board so that everybody can share a little bit from the experience. Third slide basically asks, what type of math questions can you ask about this particular image? And that might be a little harder for the students occasionally to do. I'm not going to deny it. And there's a lot of students also that might consider the wonderings mathematical wonderings. So maybe you want to change that question up a little bit. Instead of asking what math questions do you have, what are you thinking about the image that you're seeing there? So that way we're getting that idea of critical thinking moving forward a little bit. Now, in a couple moments, I'm actually going to put you to task and I'm going to ask you, what do you notice? What do you wonder about the image that you see over here? You know it's coming. Think about it. Be ready to answer that question. Now, there are other things that come with the notice and wonder activities. So first and foremost, you're going to notice that there's a handout that's also given with the notice and wonder activities. These handouts actually have both an answer key and also a handout for the students, which is wonderful. It helps us out, it guides us a lot. On the answer key, you're going to notice that there is a grade band also. And the grade band basically allows you to know what level is being expected, what concepts are being seen, and the vocabulary that's there that you would access the PowerPoint presentations that you would need. Now let's look at this example practically. So again, we had over here our lovely blocks. And let's say as a teacher, I ask you, what do you notice? What do you wonder? What kind of questions do you have? Well, to encourage the most collaboration possible amongst our students, what we want to do is we want to use a placemat format suggested by Garfield G. Newman. And you can see the idea right over here to your right. So basically what we do is we separate the placemat into the distinct spaces where our students will work. So now we have a team of 3, student A, B, and C. Each student is expected to write independently what they notice about the image. So for example, student A said, well, there's 7 columns of blocks. Student B said, well, I saw that there are 30 blocks in total. Student C said, well, each block appears to be the same, except for their color. They seem to be different colors. Then you ask them, well, what do you wonder? And again, they're doing this independently. So they're getting their independent thoughts out there first on the paper. And then you ask them, well, what questions do you have? Once they're done writing down all these different noticements, wonderments, and questions that they have independently, you ask them to collaborate together to fill out the middle block that you see there. What are the common points that you observed? So for example, they all observed that there were blocks in the images. They all wondered, are the colors important? And they all questioned, what could the blocks, the columns, represent numerically? Very interesting how far we're pushing it. Now, this is not an example that was done really by students. This was written by me, so maybe it was pushed a little bit further than what students would do, but it gives you an idea of where they can go with this. Obviously, if you're going to do an activity like this, print this out on a bigger page, letter size, 11 by 17, so they have room to write. You want it to be in their handwriting. It doesn't matter if it's not in the same direction, if it's not oriented towards one another, like it's done over here. That's fine. Again, you want them to get those ideas on there. And then the note taker can put the collaboration portion on. In terms of notes and wonder activities, again, the handouts are wonderful, but we need to be very cautious and careful. We need to align it with the QEP, with the progression of learning. So for example, over here it said, write the number 4,331,826. That's above and beyond what we ask in the QEP. So in the QEP, in the progression of learning, in the progression of learning, we go up to 1 million for grade 6. So then we just adjust the numbers in that case. You can't see it right here, but basically I had animations that removed all the little inconsistencies that made it numbers that were too high, too advanced for the students, and then changed it so that they were able to do it. Now, oftentimes when we're working these notice and wonder activities, one of the things that we forget is that students have access to manipulatives. I'm just going to remove this for a second. I apologize. So different manipulatives that the students could use. For example, the students could use an abacus to represent the place value. These students could use a sort of a map with tokens that represent place value. The students could create themselves a place value chart in which they represent the numbers both concretely using the manipulatives, in this case, the base 10 blocks. They could do it symbolically also, like you see there, and they could also do it in a more abstract format in the word format. Maybe your students want to use a number line to be able to do their noticings and wonderings. Now, all this is different ways of going about the work. Let's just bring back what I erased. Boom, right there. Now, when we're using manipulatives, we just have to be a little bit cautious and a little bit careful because we have to remember that the manipulatives is not the one and only representation of a concept. There are many ways in which it can be represented. This could be symbolically, visually, it could be contextually. There are many represent or different Now, Garfield G. Newman tells us that we do want to self-evaluate. We do want to reflect on the work that we did. And that's really important because it will enhance that critical thinking. It'll push it that extra step further. So for example, a scaled means of self-reflecting, like you see over here on the right, could be an interesting way of going about it. So for example, Are you willing to reconsider your position? So when you're looking at the image, one person saw something, another person saw something else. Can you accept that both might be right, that both might be wrong? Are you willing to defend your opinion? Are you willing to express your thoughts and your creativity on the ideas that are being seen there, the mathematical ideas? Are you being respectful to everybody on the screen? So, for example, are you listening to the ideas of others? And are you challenging them in a way that's responsible? Are you working towards a consensus? Now I'm going to work a little bit faster for the next notice and wonder activity. This one here is designed for grades 1 and 2. So again, we showed them this lovely image. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And again, in the chat, feel free to tell me what you notice and what you wonder about the image that you see over here. In a couple minutes, or a couple seconds actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to see what are your noticings, what are your wonderments about the lovely image that you see over here. So again, what do you notice and what do you wonder about the image that you see? So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat. Actually, I think I can do it this way. There we go. So I can see a variety of colors. Interesting. Noticing so many colors, so many different shapes. Any other different noticings that we have? Wonder, are there people in the baskets? Excellent wonderment. Patterns, yes, we definitely see patterns. Each balloon has a different pattern. Yes, absolutely, 200%. How big are the balloons? Very interesting question. Love it. Je vois des directions. Interesting. Notice the hot air balloons. I wonder where everybody's going. Excellent wonderments. Now, if we want to push this a little bit further, what mathematical questions could we ask about this lovely image? Some random patterns, some uttered very structured. So what mathematical questions might we be able to ask in this case? Yes? The balloons are there. Yes, absolutely. Very well said. Are there any other questions that we could potentially ask? Is there a common pattern? Interesting. It's flying the highest. Etc. I mean, we can continue on and on. In this case, the notice and wonder activity actually had to do with the commutative property of addition. So you'll notice the first question is count the number of balloons in the picture and describe how you counted them. So some students might use a one-to-one correspondence. They might point 1, 2, 3, 4. They might do it that way. Some students might say, well, I see a group of 3 and I see a group of 4. That makes 7 balloons in total. Each student is going to have a different strategy to do it. Then we look at the second question. Look at the addition sentence below. I don't like the wording addition sentence. I call it an equation. It's a question of taste. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And here your students get super excited. Oh, I noticed that but they're on different positions on both sides. Excellent. You know, right away we're on the right track. We're pushing that discussion a little bit further. Then we ask the students, look at the balloon picture to the right, the ones with the red and green balloons. What do we notice and what do we wonder? Can we write two different math equations that would represent the sum total? And again, we push these questions amongst the students. We push them and we encourage them to learn from these lovely questions. And we want that mathematical discourse. We want them engaged talking about mathematics. So as we go along, the questions are scaffolded. So yes, they were very directed at the beginning, but they get more and more challenging as we go along. So for example, in question number 6, the students are given equations. There's no more visual aid. It's just symbolic. In question number 7, the students are asked to develop their own equations that show how to add 8 and 2. By question number 9, the student is developing their own equation. They're being creative at this point. So we're pushing the thinking further and further and further. This is a super well-structured activity, this one, and it would work very well with children. What's particularly important here is that we have different representations that can be used when we are using the notice and wonder activities. And it's important that our students see these different approaches. For example, sometimes we want to show the commutative property with the Unifix cubes, and that would be a concrete approach because the students are touching the manipulative, they're being tactile with it. Then we might want to go a little more pictorial. So we might want to use maybe some 10 frames, 20 frames, whatever frames we might want to use, or maybe even number tiles to show the equality in different ways. And then we want to go a little more abstract. So we want them to actually think about the math that they're doing and start using only the symbolic representations. So we want them to write 3 plus 4 equals 7, or 4 plus 3 equals 7. And strategically, as they move along that path, they start to get more and more fluent in the way that they're presenting the procedures. They start to get more efficient, faster, better. But be careful. These different representations are not linear. We can go in any order and do them in any which way, and the student will eventually be able to appropriate them. Now, we promised you some Polypad over here, and I agree, it's time to do some Polypad. So I'm going to open it up right now onto my screen. You should be able to see Polypad. Does everybody see Polypad on my screen? Perfect, love it. So when you sign into Polypad, Polypad, it's basically a free site which gives you lots and lots of manipulatives. So for example, there are categories on the side over here on your left: geometry, numbers, fractions, algebra, probability and data, and games and application. Let's start in numbers, because today we talked a lot about numbers. Let's say, for example, I wanted to start off looking at addition with frames. So I could start off with a 10 frame, for example. I want to go a little simpler. I want to go with a 5 frame. So I change the size of it. And then I could add some tokens in there. And I will take 1 token. Let's say I want to be a little more efficient. I want to fill the whole grid right away. I can hit fill and then delete the ones I don't need. So for example, delete and delete. Make it a little bit smaller. Let's add a second number grid in here. Boom. That's it. And then let's add 2 bubbles there, or 1 bubble, let's say, 1 token. Yeah. We add the 1 token in there. And then we say to students, well, what addition does this represent? And then we can have them represent it in, again, another 5 frame. And the students could fill it up and then delete the last one that they don't need. And then they have the addition that's represented in a 10 frame. Quick, easy, and efficient. Plus, we're getting the students standing up, working on the board, showing us what they understand in a quick, efficient manner. Okay, let's say we want to delete this. We want to go to a different concept. So delete, delete. Say we want to go to number bars. Well, in this case, we could take the number bars. So for example, let's say we want to do 8 plus 7. And we want to show that it's equal to 7 plus 8, that commutative property yet again. Well, then we'll take our 7, put it just under the 8, take our 8, put it under 7, and hallelujah, wouldn't you know it, they're the same size, the same dimension. And we can even make it bigger for our students so they can see it better. Let's go on to a different way of looking at it. Maybe you prefer your number tiles and number cubes, so your base 10 blocks. So in this case, for example, we could take out the hundreds right over here. What's fun about it is we can split it up into tens. And then we could take each 10 and split it up into units or ones, depending on what we want. A easy, efficient way to work with the base 10 blocks. Now, obviously, you do want your students to have that tactile touch. You want them to use the actual concrete manipulatives in class. But this is a great complement to what you're doing. Earlier, we talked about the Unifix cubes. Well, you have Unifix cubes over here. And what's fun about them is, let's say I don't like the color blue for whatever reason. I can click on the blue. Let's split them up. So I can click on the blue one over here. I can change its color. I can make it purple because that's my favorite color, let's say. And then you can play with the Unifix cubes, making columns like we did earlier, which represented the place value. So for example, I could have rotate this. Come on. There we go. So let's say we have a column like this, right? Boom. And you'll notice that they snap together. It's wonderful. And then another column like this. Well, let's rotate that. Boom. So now I have two columns, and I can tell my students, well, what number is being represented? And it could be number 23, for example. And let's say I want it to be uniform in the colors. I could set everything to blue, and then everything to orange over here, so that blue would be my 10s, and then, sorry, I meant orange. Orange will be my 1s. Great possibility right there. Maybe you want to go a little bit further with Polypad. Maybe you want to use number cards. And in fact, I'm going to show a tool that goes even farther than just the number cards. If you go in the algebra section, you'll notice that there's a balanced scale. And we'll click on the balanced scale. Boom. Make it a little bit smaller. Let's go back to our numbers. So again, let's say we want to show students that the equation will be the same. So let's say I have 6 plus 8. And I want them to see that 8 plus 6 is going to be virtually the same. Well, I could take my 8, put it on the other side, and notice that in this case, 6 plus 8 is still bigger than 8. So what I do is I add my 6th and suddenly it's balanced. It actually fits. It makes sense. Now, the scale technically is used in algebra because we talk about keeping a balance when we're manipulating our equations in algebra. But why not use it in a simple case? It's a wonderful way to get your students thinking about math. And let's delete it. Let's keep going. For number cards, let's say you have 7 and 8, and you want your students to say what the total is. Okay, they say their hypotheses, whatever. You take all their ideas, and then you meld them together, and you get the answer. Wonderful. Love it. Okay, let's say you want to change the number on the number tile. You can come over here on the 3 dots, and I believe you should be, no, okay, we're not actually able, sorry. Sometimes on the 3 dots, you can change certain things. In this case, that's not one of them. Let's say we want a number line. Okay, create a number line right away. Boom, let's make it a little bit smaller. Right away, we can change the start point on our number line. So let's say we want to make it 5. And let's say we want our steps to be, I don't know, steps of 5. Right away, we have a beautiful number line, which our students can work with. Now we can start showing the jumps on our number line too. So for example, I'm showing jumps of 10 over here. And that you could have adjusted the length easily. And again, another jump of 10, etc. Depending on how you want to show it to your students, depending on how you want to use this tool. You can even use it with decimal numbers. So for example, if I click on the number line and go on the 3 little dots, I can change, I can put labels below, I can simplify fractions, I can allow arrows, I can change the dimensions and the width also, and that can allow me to use decimal numbers depending on what you want. Let's delete that. You've also got, for example, number grids. So let's say you want to work on multiplications, okay? And you want to get your students thinking about multiplications. Let's go back to the number tiles and cubes just for a second. So let's say, for example, I want my students to think about, I don't know, 3 times 2. So I have my 3 over here, and then I could add another one on top, 7 on top. Here. So now we can see very clearly we have 3 by 2. We have basically an array that we've created, and we can start looking at the idea of multiplications with these lovely unifix cubes. There are other things that we can do with it too. If we go, for example, in fractions, I know fractions are scary, but what's wonderful about this is we do have, for example, the whole over here. We can take our whole, we can split it, so we rename it into halves, split it even more, or split it, sorry, into halves, and then we can split that apart. So now we have 2 distinct halves that we can break apart from one another. And the halves, we can then break them up even more. And we can continue splitting it that way and showing the students how fractions are. In addition to that, if you go over here, we can go into more tools. If we go in the labels, we can change it to percentages or decimals, or even if we're in high school, degrees. Again, depending on what you want to do, there's so many possibilities with this. I've got about 2 more minutes before I will pass on to questions. If we look at probability, we've got a dice, which you can actually roll, and it is 100% randomized. You've got coins, which again, you can use and toss. So heads or tails. You've got a random number generator. If you tell it to randomize, it'll create a different number for you. And again, you can actually make adjustments to it, setting the maximum to 100, for example, if you want. You could set it as discrete numbers, continuous numbers. There's so many possibilities. You could go also with a spin dial, like you see over here. So here you could spin it for your students in class. And again, these can bring learning opportunities to your students that you might not have used otherwise. Let's say, for example, you wanted to create some charts and some statistics very quickly, very simply, very efficiently. So you have lots of possibilities. You have bar diagrams, you have broken line diagrams, you have pie charts. And again, for high school, you do have the box and whisker plots that are possibilities that you could build. I'm not going to show it all right now. You don't have the time. There are Cartesian planes. There are also tables that you have. Let's say you're doing playing cards. So again, you want to do some probability. Well, this is a great way of setting up your playing cards very quickly. In fact, you could even have a deck of 52. You could choose the what do you want, diamonds, spades, or hearts, etc. There's also other options that you have. You have, for example, different types of dice that you could use. So you could use a regular dice if you want. And then once again, you could roll it. Lots of possibilities there. You have also different games and applications. So for example, for the younger grades, let's say you're doing dominoes, you have all your dominoes over here, and boom, you can work and do additions with that. You've got clocks also that are available to you. So clocks over here. For example, you could put a live clock, which tells you the exact time right now, which is interesting for students to look at too. You could take away the seconds, for example. You could put in, there's so much that you can do with this. It's ridiculous. Even when you go in geometry, let's say we go in polygons and shapes. We want to put, I don't know, pentagon on the board. Okay, cool. Well, what can we do with that? Well, we could calculate potentially the perimeter. And the perimeter is actually set right now, it's over here. So we have the perimeter that comes out. Now, obviously, we're assuming that each side is 1 unit in this case. We could have the area come up also if we wanted to. We could have music options. So let's say, for example, we want our students to understand the vertexes, the number of vertexes. Well, in that case, we click over here on play. Now, in this case, it was a little bit fast, but we could slow it down fairly simply. So far, so good. I haven't lost anybody yet, I hope. Let's go check the chat and see what's up in there. So I see some love it's, I see some oh wows, oh cools, and great on our tactile board. Absolutely, yes, I agree to 100%. At this point, I've talked a lot. I think it's a good time to open up the board a little bit to you. If you have any questions that you would like to ask me, please feel free to do so, whether it be in the chat, whether it be in person, live, like your sound if you prefer. Whatever you want, the board is up to you. You are allowed to ask me any questions at this point. You write them up if you have to. What makes a good thinking task? Interesting as far as questions go. So a good thinking task is one that will allow your students to engage in mathematics, converse together, discourse, You want them to go home and even tell their parents in an excited manner, oh, Mom, Dad, I worked on this today and it was so cool. It was completely different from what I've seen before. And I can't, other people had different ideas than me, but we all came to a mutual idea at the end. A good thinking class is one where you're acting as the facilitator and not a direct teacher. So you want the students to learn from their experiences, not necessarily from you pushing the matter in their faces or the content in their faces. A good thinking task is one that will let students eventually formulate their own evaluation criteria as to what made that task interesting to them, what made them learn more, for example. A good thinking task will lead the students to ask questions, to come back to you next class. Sir, I didn't understand this concept. Could you show me in another way? I don't know if you'll agree or disagree, but again, the floor is up to you. You're allowed to ask any questions that you might have. Answer all your questions. Is there a book that gets student engaged in thinking tasks? Yes, there are many books that you could actually use. So first and foremost, there is the book by Peter Ligel. So I will write the title in the chat. Is called Building Thinking Classrooms, right? Mathematics, grades K to 12, 14 practices or 14 teaching practices for enhancing learning. So that book is excellent. Yes, there are different picture books also that we can use for critical thinking. I'll get to that in a second. That's not a problem. So we've got that as a book that could be very interesting for critical thinking. We've got another book that Peter has also created, which involves thinking tasks that you can give to your students. It's actually a green book. It just came out last year. I don't have it on me right now, so I can't show it to you, but those are other options that you have. There's also the book by Garfield G. Newman, which you've seen in my presentation. You saw the cover page for it. I don't remember the title of it by heart, but it is there. It's in my references also. In terms of picture books, so for example, let's say we want to get our students thinking. Let's say young students and we want to get them thinking. The Hungry Caterpillar is a great book that can engage students in critical thinking. So in The Hungry Caterpillar, there's a caterpillar that is very, as we would say in French, gourmand, very hungry. So he will eat a different amount of foods every day. So we can get the students counting with that, figuring out how much the total amount of food will be, engaging them in different ways to represent the story that they're hearing. I do have a copy of The Hungry Caterpillar over here. I'm not going to go get it right now because I did not expect to have to do that, but it is one of the books that are possible for you to use. Another book that was recommended by actually Kevin Dykema, who talked about productive struggle, was the Productive Struggle Bus, which is a little picture book which will help students understand what productive struggle actually is for them and how it can be engaging for them. Any other questions? Any other?
There's
Just to
one
add
more.
on
Oh,
to, sorry, go for it.
it's your question, Chris, so you go first.
Oh, I just put into, I had asked that question to a librarian that we did a webinar with a couple of years ago, and she gave me all of these books. So please feel free. There's a Padlet full of them, and they're emerging numeracy books. So they'll get, patterns and money and shapes and measuring and all that kind of stuff. So you can help yourself to them. But they do kind of set the tone and kind of grab that. I guess too, Alex, one of the things I was going to ask is when kids get engaged, how do you hook them? Like, how do you get them engaged in wanting to pursue the discourse, the thinking? Do you have any thoughts or tips or tricks that you offer to teachers when you're trying to create that engagement where the kids are like you saying, "Oh, I want to go home and tell," and they want to talk about math at home when their parents get home?
Well, it's funny that you talk about the launch because the launch is actually very critical here. Our tendency is to go with a binary approach. So, what do you think? And the students will say yes or no, but they're not really thinking, right? We want them to have a range of possibilities that they could think about, which will then lead them to have a better understanding of the content and a better engagement in the content also. So, for example, I've often used Mentimeter as a means of letting the students see where the average range is. It's actually a fun interactive way to let the students see what's going on, and to see that thought process moving in the classroom too. You don't just want to target that one student who's always willing to answer, who's always willing to give the answer. You need to get everybody involved, which is why it's important to have some group work, which is why it's important to have a sense of community in your classroom.
Thanks, he said. Thank you. Do you want to ask my other question, Leanne?
I think you covered it. You're good.
That's right. That's right. I'd asked about productive struggle, but then you covered it like a couple of slides after. So I like that a lot.
Does anybody else have any other questions that they would like to ask? I hope you can see also the advantages of using Polypad within your classroom, because using manipulatives is key to getting them to that conceptual understanding. If you don't use the manipulatives, you're hindering your students. And again, it's not just using the pictorial visual ones that we have on Polypad, it's also using the physical manipulatives in class to extend the student learning, to make them eventually get more fluent in their procedures. Also, as teachers, you have to be flexible about the answers that your students are going to give. Not all students are going to use the 10 frames to represent their answers. Not all students are going to use the base 10 blocks. Not all students might even represent it symbolically. That doesn't mean their answer is wrong necessarily. It just means that they're at a different place in their thought process. Cautious about that. Yes, Polypad is absolutely 100% free, which is why it's such a wonderful resource to use. It does take a little bit of manipulation, a little bit of playing around with it to get familiar with it. Initially, when you do go on it, there are tons and tons and tons of instructions hidden behind it all. So you do have to play with it a little bit. But once you start playing with it, it comes super quickly. I know certain people in certain French centres d'escalade are using Polypad, even though the terms are in English, the manipulatives are represented very well, and that ultimately is a universal language.
We have a lot of thank yous in the chat. So before we lose people, I just want to thank everyone again for attending today's webinar and for participating and engaging through the chat. It's really nice to see. And even those who have their camera on, thank you. And Alex, thank you for being here. Your
My
expertise
pleasure.
is very valuable, and so we appreciate that you're sharing it with the wider community beyond your scope of NFSB. So